den rechten.
Bir müşteri olan
Den rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
Yves Jouffe from LVMT. That's yet another acronym, are you sure? LVMT, what does that mean? City Mobility Transport Laboratory. And if star, do you want the acronym? Explain. As soon as you use an acronym, you have to explain it. Well, we'll run over time then. Anyway, we'll stick to École des Ponts et Chaussées and Leslie Béton from the French Institute of Transport, Development and Network Sciences and Technology. Anyway, our title may sound a bit negative, but we're going to look at an empirical survey carried out by Leslie based on household practices, humble households living in the peri-urban. We'll explain where we met these households, and we want to put these uses of energy for mobility and housing in the context of a triple constraint: economic constraints, social constraints related to standards, and environmental constraints which have to do with demands placed on people, symbolic constraints that defines the triple vise of peri-urban unsustainability. Here to put this interpretation framework into context very quickly, let's talk about the discourse about the peri-urban. Two types of discourse, not just one, that are at loggerheads, but that also overlap. They are not consecutive, but simultaneous. One looking negatively at single-family houses and car use, judgment passed by the urban elites on political decision-making to criticize cars and detached houses that are bad for everybody's quality of life. The second discourse is related to houses as the house, the detached house, as a legitimate aspiration, what it has to offer, security, the control over your environment. This is a discourse that's produced by most buyers, builders, developers, energy providers. This is something that you can see in the illustrations. Urban planners, politicians who all support and give legitimacy to this aspiration. These discourses highlight two types of constraints on humble households and their practices. Here, let's look at their energy practices, their uses of energy for, as I said, daily mobility, but also for housing users. First of all, the first discourse imposes ecological demands, where the peri-urban is detrimental both to city and countryside. The peri-urban pollutes both other types of spaces. There are also social standards, which I've explained, the second discourse that gives a lot of positive values to the peri-urban, but also imposes constraints in terms of personal success and self-fulfillment. So many things that will happen more in the peri-urban, because the peri-urban benefits from the best of both town and country. And the third constraint that defines the third dimension of this vice, about the way households use energy, namely the energy constraint, making this equation intractable. They can't go back to the city center because it's too expensive, or they can't do some home improvement work to insulate them or invest in a more eco-friendly car. I'll hand over to Leslie, who, based on the interviews that she did will try to answer how peri-urban households cope with these three constraints. Do they have environmental concerns? And are their practices environmental themselves? Okay, very quickly, because as researchers, well, that's something we can't help but do, but I'll share with you a few results from a broader survey with 30 households in peri-urban areas that depend on the car. Here you can see on the map where we did the survey. These were towns in Seine-et-Marne and in Côte d'Or, in the east of Dijon. I'm sorry, there's no scale on this map. Geographers will forgive me. I know it's from Google Maps, but that's no excuse. And when you ask how households cope with these three constraints and how they take environmental demands into account and try to find answers, they don't really seem to care about them. They don't really talk about these demands spontaneously. You have to ask them questions about that to elicit a response from them. So it doesn't seem to be a very effective pressure, this environmental pressure. And although they recognize this environmental constraint, they oppose it with daily constraints. When Sandra is asked about a possibility of cutting on her commute, well, she won't do that. She needs to go shopping, pick up the kids, all the important stuff. No, I'm not going to change anything. So these daily constraints are opposed to peri-urban social standards and aspirations, having a detached house and a certain level of consumption. Here it's a quote from Vincent, who says, "If you really want to become green, then we'll live in wooden shacks in the middle of the forest and tell people no gas, no power, no cars. If you want veg, you can fetch them from your garden. If you want to eat rabbits, well, breed them at the back of the garden." Do you think people are going to go back to that? Candlelight, no TV, no internet, no driving to work. You would have to take a horse carriage to go to work. That will be environmental, but we'll never go back to that. We've reached a point of no return. That's a real problem. These are the answers that are generally made by these people. And these daily constraints and with these aspirations, there are also economic constraints, having a decent standard of living despite the resources that you have and that are in line with social standards. These are concerns that are seen as legitimate and that offset, that neutralize and cancel the environmental demands placed on these households. So they find arrangements with their ecological conscience, and these pressures are not as high, they think, as the other constraints, the economic constraints, and a certain view of social success. And yet, although these households seem to repress their ecological conscience, they seem to have eco-friendly or virtuous uses of energy. What's noteworthy is that they're green without realizing it. Or at least they're not actively green, or they don't claim to be green. We can give you a number of practices that they described in order to reduce their use of energy: carpooling, wood heating, turning off the heater in the daytime and putting on the jumper, using self-production to avoid some purchases. This list is not exhaustive, but this is something that they promote in their discourse, and it's all related to economic constraints because they want to pay less And we said that the most sustainable households were the poorest because they don't travel. And here, this is not as extreme, but it's the same idea. And these cost-effective or virtuous practices are also applied to housing, especially heating costs are big expenditures that are more visible and things that people may reduce more easily. But in the territories that we looked at, transport is essential, especially car transport. To sum up, there are ecological practices that are not actively promoted as green, but they are simply ways of better coping with peri-urban standards and economical constraints. It's also due to the fact that they're close to greenery, the return to the countryside, and that gives rise to ecological practices, but not actively green ones. And I'll hand back over to Yves. Based on this analysis of underlying practices, we see that all the various aspects of the vise have relative effectiveness. And this opens up the scope for further research, especially to guide public policy in order to change these practices based on the ineffectiveness of environmental demands on practices themselves. We are encouraged to move away from guilt-inducing policies, inducing guilt about these bad uses, because all these policies would be in vain. However, one lever that can be used is the economic aspect. In that case, maybe public policy could promote and value eco-friendly practices based on economic considerations, removing the stigma attached to it. And regarding social peri-urban standards, one avenue for action would be to promote a peri-urban ideal, people being sustainably rooted in their territories, and something that would not be identified with an unsustainable peri-urban standard. Here, that harks back to the use of showing these detached houses in communications by developers or government communication, which is also trying to promote energy efficiency. Maybe these types of public or private communication could be reoriented towards more sustainable goals. Public policy could also promote more research to look at these issues not at a given point in time, to look at what the practices are, but also look at how these practices change over the long term in order to understand how social standards contribute and see whether households will awaken to a less energy-intensive way of life in order to remove the constraints of peri-urban unsustainability. Thank you very much.
Francis Bossier, your comments. Well, the reason I'm here is through no choice of mine. I mean, this was the. I mean, we're happy that you should be here. Well, so am I. So am I. But again, I'm not trying to impose my presence. Talking about the, as you said, the triple vise. If you've come up with such a contraption, you really need to have a patent on it. This sort of incredible type of machinery. Well, in energy you have power is needed for heating, for lighting, but also for transportation. And it's not quite the same, but the two are related. And in fact, the two presentations we heard were also connected. Now, ADEME, the energy government agency, and I think it was between 2006, 2007, we had quintiles of households. The poorest 20%. The total energy bill, housing plus transportation, was up 50%. For the wealthiest 20%, the energy bill was down 15%. For some people, energy costs went up faster than income, and for the wealthier, it was the other way around. Now, you have in peri-urban areas people that are less well off. So usually these are people that are less highly skilled, less well paid, and sometimes they have local jobs, local low-skilled jobs, maybe working in shops as or other menial jobs. Now, do we know just how many miles they travel? I mean, per level of income. And I mean, I know Mireille has spent a lot of time on this, but if you look at the number of miles traveled by more humble households, is it lower, which means that they spend less money on transportation if they travel less. So the real issue is the bottom line. I mean, what is the price level of energy that brings about a change in mobility patterns and in mobility practices? And it looks as though the price of energy has got to go an awful way up before it makes a difference to households. But for well-to-do households, the price of energy has got to go an awful way up, maybe less so for the less well-off. Now, if you look at the price of energy for travel in fossil fuel, it was stable till the 80s, then went up again after the mid-2000s, but it's not back to where it was in the 1980s. So I don't know if we can draw exact mathematical conclusions, but it looks as though the price of energy has got to rise an awful lot in order to bring about a change in mobility, including for more humble households, even if they travel, even if they don't travel as much. I mean, this is where the economy and the ecology come together. This is an area you haven't broached, so maybe this was a bit misplaced. It wasn't misplaced at all. I looked at some humble households. Some of them did have local jobs. Others had more distant, more remote jobs. Many blue-collar workers in the Dijon area, some in the Seine-et-Marne area. Many of them worked either in Paris or in the outskirts of Paris, even though they lived further afield. Now, looking at the price of energy, you have different practices in the Dijon area. Carpooling amongst blue-collar workers has existed for some time, and it's especially because of the high prices of gasoline. You have a lot of carpooling. In the Paris area, many households use public transportation when public transportation is accessible, or where their jobs are accessible by public transportation, if only because these are not very well to do, and the employer pays half the rail pass, and of course the employer will not pay for their gas bills, for their car bills. So of course they have an incentive to use public transportation right there. Now, I didn't inquire about the total transportation budget. Some of them came up with a spontaneous figure, others couldn't. It depended on all sorts of factors, whether there are children at home, whether there's somebody working, whether it was a working couple, only one parent worked, and so that makes a difference in terms of transportation needs. Also, the rate of change of transportation of the energy bill, and for equal transportation, a sudden increase in energy prices can bring about a sudden change, whereas a gradual change will not necessarily bring about such a change in behavior. Are you happy with this answer, the answer from Francis? Francis is delighted with the answer.
Den Rechten.